This is Podcast Local from On The Go FM, Episode 3.
A lot of people will look at Mississippi and they'll get a narrative about what's going on in Mississippi or who Mississippi is, and that's not necessarily really who we are. I mean, that's part of it for sure. I mean, we can't deny what Mississippi is seen as, but at the same time, it's not just that. You can't just look at the negative history and even the negative present and see that as the holistic picture. You need to know about all of us and what we're doing, and those of us who are not leaving Mississippi out of frustration but are staying here and try to move the needle forward a bit. So we have to own this, and we have to, if not fix it, show that people are actually working here to try to fix it.
That's Beau York from Let's Talk Jackson, a local podcast for Jackson, Mississippi. Beau is my guest on this episode of Podcast Local, a show about telling the stories of your community. I'm Jason Norris. Support for Podcast Local comes from the Satchel Podcast Player. It's an app for Android and iOS and features an easy way to find local podcasts in your community. Learn more or register your show at satchelplayer.com. You'll also learn more about the Satchel Player later in this episode. That's one of the projects Beau York has been working on, in addition to hosting multiple podcasts and running a podcast network. How did you get started podcasting?
Oh, wow. About four or 5 years ago, I was working in telecommunications and product development marketing, and I'd always loved podcasting. I'd always loved listening to podcasts. But what I found was kind of interesting is that a lot of the emotional connections that we were trying to create in various marketing campaigns, I was actively feeling those in podcasts. Like this deep sense of trust, this deep sense of community, being engaged with the content as opposed to just passively consuming it. These were experiences that I found in podcasting that I really didn't feel in any other place. So I knew this was a really powerful media, but after listening for 10 years prior to that, I noticed it never really took off. And so I was trying to understand podcasting as an industry, and I had an opportunity to leave my job and kind of go out on my own and start my own podcast company, and that's what I did about 3 years ago, a little bit over that. We started the Podastery Studios here in Jackson, Mississippi. We now actually have a studio, an actual studio. It started out in my house, and now we actually have a studio downtown, which is wonderful. And anyway, the goal was to really dive into podcasting and understand it as an industry, understand what works, test a lot of theories, and create some really powerful content that both engaged, entertained, informed, and also, supported a business model as well.
So where did the name Podastery come from?
I wanted to create a new word, and so I went through a lot of different names, but ultimately I combined podcast and monastery. So the idea is that it's a combination of those two words. Podastery, it's kind of a place to get in touch with a higher form of content, was kind of the mindset, but somewhat ironically, I'm dyslexic, and so I look at it and I don't even know how to pronounce it if I hadn't come up with the words. So what people always say is they always refer to it as podastery as opposed to podastery, which is perfectly fine. At this point, I've gotten used to it. I was a little offended before, but then I remembered just how many names I've butchered over my years on the mic, and how many words I've stumbled through just as a dyslexic. So I'm totally fine. You can call it whatever you want, but yeah, that's where the name came from.
So you said you started out wanting to, explore this. How was it in the beginning? What kind of podcasts did you do, and how well did you do at them?
My goal really was understanding, exploring podcasting with the ultimate goal of trying to figure out what's holding it back so we can kind of progress it forward. I had theories going in about, creating very niche focused content, narrow casting as opposed to broadcasting, if you will. And so I had some pretty strict goals for myself. I wanted to create a podcast for a small business and get paid to do it. I wanted to create a podcast that was going to be featured on iTunes, and I wanted to have over 100 iTunes reviews. And so I'm happy to say we actually did all of that within the first year, which is really, really great. The first small business that we reached out to was a little pipe tobacco shop actually here in Jackson, Mississippi. It's this little boutique pipes and pipe tobacco. They've got cigars as well, but they're really more of a pipe-centric shop. And I went to them and I told them, look, people don't buy products from retail anymore. If they're shopping retail, what they're really truly shopping for is experience. And with this little mom and pop shop, I mean, it's brick and mortar, just filled with charm. It is a unique experience. And so if you were to take that experience and put it in some sort of digital format that gives your existing customers a little piece or taste of the shop, that draws them back in, beckons them back in, gets them more brand loyal, gets them more sticky, and in turn buys more products, it'll really set you kind of a cut above everyone else. And so that was kind of the pitch that I gave to them in creating what became Country Squire Radio. The shop is called the Country Squire, or the Country Squire Tobacconist. We created Country Squire Radio as a weekly morning-style radio show dealing specifically with pipes and pipe tobacco and just the spirit of this little mom-and-pop tobacco shop. And so what we found is that not only did we really connect with the existing clientele of that shop, and it did exactly what it set out to, but because we entered into such a very specific focused area, we quickly found this international audience, or rather this international audience found us, and we grew to become the number one podcast on pipes and pipe tobacco in the world, which is really great. This little mom and pop shop in Jackson, Mississippi is now shipping internationally and has become a known brand in that industry, which is crazy. So that was one of the shows that we did. That was probably the longest running show that we've got right now. We also created a program called Flash TV Talk, which is dedicated to the CW's Flash. It's a great television program. It's something that, after show podcast is kind of like an interesting space in podcasting, because it's kind of this high demand, somewhat low supply. It used to be low supply. Now it's almost like a gold rush every single time there's a new television series for podcasts to kind of be created around them. But we were one of the first that entered into the space, and we got a really great audience behind us. We've actually had that show featured by the CW twice. We've been featured by iTunes on that show, and we got well over 100 iTunes reviews for that one. We've been able to interview several of the actors from the show. We actually recently did one with the actor that portrays Gorilla Grodd from the television series. So if any of your listeners are interested, they should definitely check that out. He was an interesting character. But yeah, and so again, very niche focus, right? I mean, not nowhere on the radio are you going to hear an hour-long in-depth discussion of, the CW's Flash, but you can actually get podcasts that are specifically about that. And so, the numbers are never going to be gangbusters for either of those shows, for example, in terms of, there's never going to be millions and millions of people tuning in specifically because they want to hear 45 minutes of, talk about this one television show. But those that do are very passionate. They're very dedicated to whatever the subject matter that's being covered. And so that dedication and that interest is something that we share with them, they share with us, and it also creates a stronger relationship than, like I said, most anything else that you're going to just kind of passively consume.
Where do you see the podastery going in the future?
One of the things that we've been doing is really about testing the industry and trying to understand it so that we can identify the pain points and move forward. And, I know we'll talk about that a little bit later on, but of course, now we've got this new company dedicated to really addressing those pain points and progressing podcasting as an industry. But with that being said, we still do have the Podastery Studios going on and going strong. And so right now we have kind of our tentpole shows, kind of our top tier shows that we continue on going. Basically, if they're making money, they're sticking around. The ones that were a little bit more experimental, we were able to kind of offload to another show. We actually just recently sold one of our podcasts, which was the number one video game podcast in America there for a while, called the Pokemon Go podcast. And so I was happy to create that show. We've actually been working on it for months. And so to be able to create it and then sell it to another network so that they can take it to the next level was really great. So we may do things like that in the future if we kind of see opportunities going on in terms of, identifying a need in terms of infotainment, so to speak, coming up, laying the groundwork, getting the right talent behind it, and then finding, eventually selling the show to someone else who can kind of take it to the next level. We may still do that in some capacity, but mostly right now we're kind of built on supporting the shows that we have, including our local podcast and the local podcast community as well.
What did you do? What made the jump then to focus on the local community?
I've always had a passion for kind of content that was dedicated to a local community, and the idea of creating these experiences between locals and also getting more connected with the audience that is actually local has always appealed to me. And so, I mentioned Country Squire Radio, how our initial goal was to connect with the existing local community within that subgroup, but then that exploded and kind of took us far beyond that, which is great. But but I still felt like there was something there. There was something, kind of a need to create content for the local community and kind of drive awareness. I mean, we're in central Mississippi. Podcasting, even still, as it's kind of experienced a boost, it's still a little bit more behind the times here in terms of educating people about what podcasting is and what it can be. So we actually reached out to a coffee shop. It was kind of our next move in terms of creating local content. They had an event called Afternoon Vinyl, where they would have local musicians come and play records during the afternoon, and we would actually go in and set up our mics and actually record on site at Cups in Fondren, which is the name of the coffee shop, and record these little interviews with these musicians, and their music would be playing in the background. You'd have the ambiance of the coffee shop. They would talk a little bit about the record that was playing at the time, as well as kind of what music has been to them and how it's taken their career. And it was a really interesting little show. I was really kind of proud of how it turned out, although we were entering into this kind of niche within a area, which was really difficult to find an audience. I mean, those that did find it really enjoyed it, but I mean, for all 12 of those people, it was great. But for the most part, it was a little difficult finding the audience. And so really that laid the groundwork for what would eventually become what is now kind of our local flagship show, which is called Let's Talk Jackson. I loved what we did with Cups. I thought it was really great, but I wanted something to be a little bit more quiet. I wanted something that was going to be open for the guests to talk about what their experience has been and what they're doing, and maybe go a little bit deeper than you'd feel comfortable doing on the balcony of a coffee shop. So we wanted to kind of create this more quiet space, as well as open it up to not just musicians. So Let's Talk Jackson was started at a local event, which we do here, called Fondren's First Thursday. It's a local community of artists and businesses kind of come together and create a street event. We set up our mics and once again went to recording. We actually interviewed a couple of business leaders and a couple of artists, put that content together, and started a seasonal show called Let's Talk Jackson. We do about 20 episodes a season with a good month. It's a month and a half break in between seasons to make sure that we're getting really good content and getting a good polished experience. That one started out, it was me and a friend. The friend was only able to kind of do it a little bit part of the time. He ended up having to drop out by the time we really started things going. Then in season 2, I actually opened it up and we brought in some 2 additional hosts. And by that time, we actually had sponsorship, which was great, so I could actually pay them for their work. And we are well into creating content, or at least gathering interviews for season 3. And so hopefully we'll have that out fairly soon.
I wanted to ask you, you said that you started out with the other show recording in a coffee shop. How was that set up with guests, with dealing with the noise, but also dealing with, you're confiscating part of the coffee shop for a while?
Yeah, no, they were very supportive of it. We reached out to them first to see if they were interested. We at that point didn't feel comfortable seeing if they actually wanted to actively sponsor the show. So we just said, look, we want to test this out. We want to see if this will work. Maybe if it blows up, maybe we might do something. But for now, how about we just have the space and you give us free coffee? And I was happy to do it for that reason. And so they allowed us to have the space. We had 2 kind of mic stands that we set up around a table that was pretty close to where the music was actually playing. Like I said, you had that kind of ambiance in the background. And yeah, the great thing about it was the spectacle of having kind of these 2 mics and a computer and somebody interviewing somebody. It gets people's attention, which of course for the business is really great because they want people like, okay, what's going on over there? It's like the radio spots of back in the day. I guess they continue, of course, to do this today. When you see radio spots, it gets your attention. You kind of want to know what's going on. It's like that, but on a much more intimate level, right? So there is kind of this desire to see what's going on and to find out. And, you can download the podcast. Actually, here's the website. Go do that right now, and you can hear some stuff that we've done in the past, and go ahead and get some coffee while you're at it. So it was they were all for it, man. It worked out really well.
Okay, that's cool. With your local show, do you record all of the interviews for the season ahead of time, or do you stick to a weekly basis?
We started off recording week to week. The second season was about half and half. This third season, I'm really trying to get as much as we possibly can done before the season even begins. My time has become a little bit more difficult to work out for good reasons, but I want to make sure that we're creating more content. And I'm also trying to take a little bit more of a step back with that show and just work more the production angle and have the Well, and I say production, more like oversight. Our hosts that we actually have come on that record it do produce their own episodes to an extent, and then I come back behind them and put some additional polish on them.
So right now with your local show, what would you say are the biggest challenges? What are you facing?
The biggest challenge, I think, overall, when you're creating a local podcast for a local community, especially a community that's not necessarily very tourist-driven, the challenge is mostly monetization. You have to get sponsors that are really interested to see the concept grow and really almost kind of support the concept of the podcast at this stage. With obviously, there's a hope that as you grow your audience and people go back, they'll find kind of those early sponsors and support their businesses as well. But mostly, yeah, it's been a bit of a challenge in terms of getting sponsors on board. We started off season 2 selling sponsorship at a pretty low rate, and then near the end of the season, we were able to kind of increase it a little bit. In season 3, we're hoping to actually get a season-long sponsor as opposed to kind of chopping it up into episodes as we've done in the past. But at the same time, we're still trying to figure out exactly what that's going to look like. So that's probably been the biggest challenge. The thing that I thought was going to be more of a challenge that's not is actually getting people to get on mic. We actually last season we had the mayor of our fair town here come into the studio and record. And that was something that I had wanted to do for a while, but I always felt a little bit nervous about reaching out to the mayor. And I don't know why I felt nervous about doing it out of the house, and then I felt a little bit more comfortable doing it out of the studio. But and if you saw our studio, you'd think that's kind of funny because, asking the mayor to come out downtown to an abandoned warehouse where, like we promised, there's a studio in here. It's a little bit of a scary prospect. He did have his bodyguard with him, which was great because the bodyguard stood outside the door while we were recording. It was pretty crazy. But anyway, so the availability of people to kind of get behind and get on mic has been really great. And part of what we've wanted to do is realize that what we did with the Country Squire and what we're continually doing with Country Squire Radio, that's a unique setup. I mean, not everybody is going to have the ability to go in and just own the market for their particular niche. Many will, especially right now, because there's still a lot of opportunity in kind of finding that niche in podcasting. But not everybody can do that, especially in the local community. So what we want to do is not necessarily create a show where we're going to have, weekly subscribers. We've got a base. It's great to have those that tune in every single week. But our goal is to really give each individual company or musician, artist, entrepreneur, whomever it is, basically give them 30 minutes to come on, pitch their show, and give that to their existing customers as a way to get more involved with the brand that they're creating. And it's worked out really well. It's been great to see kind of the stories that have come out through discussions on the show that consumers or fans hadn't realized about whoever it was they were already following. And so, there's sometimes you can get more out of somebody from just sitting, across a table from them in a quiet space with a microphone than you can in a blog post or than you can in some sort of marketing jargon. It's a powerful thing.
Yeah. Is there a particular niche you're really going for within the community, or is basically anyone who lives in Jackson potentially could come and be a guest?
That anyone could come in and be a guest it sounds good, but I think probably what we're going for is, people who are doing something. You have to be doing something to add value to the experience of living in Jackson, and whether that makes you, maybe you're an artist, maybe you're a musician, maybe you're an entrepreneur, maybe you're working in the nonprofit sector, or maybe you're working in the government. We tend to not do too many government interviews because we're not a political show. Even when I got the mayor on, I didn't want to ask too many hard-hitting questions because we're just not that kind of show. We want to be the platform to let other people tell their own story. And so, with that in mind, it can technically be anybody as long as you're doing something of interest or something that's adding value to the local community. Our tagline is that we provide artists, activists, entrepreneurs, musicians, and more, and that it's conversations from the capital city and beyond. Of course, Jackson as the capital of Mississippi. We do, I suppose, if we were to kind of have an internal mantra that's not necessarily publicized just because we already have 2 taglines and we don't need a third, it's really about, telling our own stories. A lot of people will look at Mississippi and they will, they'll get a narrative about what's going on in Mississippi or who Mississippi is. And that's not necessarily really who we are. I mean, that's part of it for sure. I mean, we can't deny, what Mississippi, is seen as, but at the same time, it's not just that. You can't just look at the negative history and even the negative present and see that as the whole holistic picture. You need to know about all of us and what we're doing, and those of us who are not leaving Mississippi out of frustration, but are staying here and trying to, and try to move the needle forward a bit. In fact, that's not just kind of the mindset of the people behind this show. That's actually the mindset of a lot of people in the local podcast community that we've discovered. There's a lot of great people making content in Jackson, not necessarily tailored for the local community, or at least not intentionally tailored for the local community, but definitely kind of tapping into the local community. And so seeing that as kind of the persistent thing, like, look, we're here. Even if we move somewhere, we're always going to be from Mississippi. So we have to own this, and we have to, if not fix it, show that people are actually working here to try to fix it.
That's a good response. It's a good focus to podcasting is a great way to create a community. And if you live within a community and you podcast for that community, then to me, that's a very positive impact that you can have on that community. I was just curious about how it has worked for you and what you've seen in the community since you've been podcasting local.
One of the challenges in terms of creating content for your local community really comes down to discoverability, because you could be out there creating your podcast for, your town or your state or wherever. And if they can't find you, it's going to be difficult. And so with our new company, Satchel, one of the things that we've done in trying to create a podcast player and a podcast experience that really helps podcasters and listeners at every single level, we created the world's first podcast player that actually allows you to find content based on location. And so we've actually used the tool that we've created to start not only finding content to listen to, but also finding other podcasters to network with, which is how we kind of got in touch with all of these other people who are making podcasts. The mindset behind this too is, people say all the time that podcasting is the future of radio, and there's definitely a truth to that, but it's important to look at what radio has historically been and what it's been able to do that podcasting, at least in the recent years, just hasn't. And that really is about creating content for the local community. If you think about kind of historically what people could listen to, the towers would go up and radio would broadcast over the towers, and they would only be able to reach to whatever that radius is. And so it was limiting in terms of the reach, but at the same time, the good part of that is good, rich content was being created specific for that radius. And so, as you're kind of tapping into here, and I think what you've realized and written about is absolutely true, we have an opportunity in podcasting to create that kind of rich experience and rich content specific to our areas. And thanks to, solutions like Satchel, people are now able to find people who are creating content specifically for that area and that region.
And this would probably be a great time to talk about your sponsorship of Podcast Local.
That does lead into it. I mean, one of the things that I saw once, I saw you posting in the Facebook group and wanting to do this podcast, I thought, oh, this is great. This is perfect, because one of the challenges that exists in a pre-Satchel world is that it's not really easy to find people who are creating podcasts based on location. The great thing is with Satchel now you're able to do that, but we have to get the word out to the people beforehand. So
exactly,
Satchel definitely opens up opportunities, but we have to lay the groundwork there. So when I saw that you were doing this podcast and listen to the quality of some of your other work, I was like, oh, well, this is definitely something that we want to be a part of and help you get the word out in terms of the benefits of creating podcasts for the local community and, best practices for people who are already doing this and also kind of some help for people who are wanting to do this, as well as letting your listeners know, and especially the podcasters who are creating local content, that they should register with Satchel, that they should, that way people can discover their content based on their location. And then they can also use the application to find other people in their local community that are making podcasts. Because the great thing is, even somebody who is in your general vicinity, even if they're, maybe they're not making the, Miami, Florida show. Maybe you're making the Miami, Florida show and they're making a podcast about, let's say, I don't know, gardening. Y'all have two very different niches that you're focusing on, but at the same time, you can work a lot together and learn a lot from each other and share best practices with each other. We're seeing a lot of these podcaster meetups happening all over the country. And one of the great things is that Satchel is wanting to do is actually reach out to a lot of these podcast meetups and, buy pizza and kind of help facilitate the growing community of content creators around the country, especially those that are wanting to do it on a local level. And I shouldn't just limit it to the country. We actually, globally as well. Earlier this year, I was in London for New Media Europe, specifically talking about podcasting and technology and where podcasting is going. And there's a strong European podcast community as well that's really trying to look out for one another and find one another, and really resonates with the idea of a tool that both presents their content on a local space as well as gives them an opportunity to find each other. So if you go to satchelplayer.com today, you can register your podcast. You can download the application. It's available on iPhone and Android.
Now, I got a question, too, about that. Do local podcasters need to register, or will it automatically pick up the fact that they are podcasting from a particular location?
It's all part of the registration process. It's a little bit of both. The registration process will help give us some basic information on where you're geographically located. And then we have an algorithm that scrubs registered content for locally sourced versus locally focused. So that if you do have a podcast that, for example, is focused specifically on your location, it raises to the top so that people looking for local content are going to find your show first.
That's very cool. So you said you're in a studio now, right?
That's right. And we do kind of refer to it as Podastery Studios because technically over the last couple of months, we've almost had 3 active studios at one given time. We've got kind of our primary studio, which is where I'm located. We've got our studio in quotations, if you will, which is the equipment that we actually have set up at the Country Squire, because now we've started broadcasting. We'll do the podcast live from their shop after they close. And so we actually got some equipment specifically to keep there. And then we also had a studio that we set up for some kids as part of the youth media program here, a podcast studio that's actually a couple blocks from here in their building, which is we internally called it Podastery Junior, but decided not to call that in front of the kids because, kids never like being called kids. So they're the students. So maybe Podastery U or something, Podastery High or something of that nature that would be a little bit better. But we could never quite figure out what to call that. But anyway, yes, we have our primary studio, but it certainly wasn't always that way. As I mentioned, I started off doing everything outside of my house. And actually, it was when we started the local podcast that really made me say, okay, we need to actually move this out of the house and put this, somewhere where people can come out to, and I don't have to be that creepy guy saying, hey, come to my house, I want to talk to you and record you. There's just kind of a sense where it's like, all right, I do feel a little awkward about this. But if it's a little bit more like, hey, we've got a studio, come record, it breaks down a couple of barriers there, so to speak.
That's true. You said you got a couple of kids. How old are they?
I've got a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old.
How did you handle podcasting with kids in the house?
Oh, yeah. Well, so daycare. It's probably pretty good. Well, let's think about this. Actually, when we started off, we were doing things at night. So it was after they went down for bed. And actually, I started off before my second was born. So yeah, it really wasn't too terrible. Just it was mostly about recording around bedtime and making sure that they were down and out for the evening before actually getting on mic. And once we started daycare, I was able to record obviously in the day, which was very helpful. The daycare helps with Mama being at work and Daddy now being at the studio. They can. Somebody's watching the kids.
Somebody's taking care of it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a challenge. Do y'all have a dog like I do that is just whining in the background?
So we did. We had a dog named Gibbs, and we loved Gibbs, but Gibbs was a little too wild, and it wasn't the podcast that ended up having to send Gibbs to another home, but it was the fact that he was a little too rough with the kids, unfortunately. But
that's yeah.
Well, and he was fine. I mean, nothing bad ever happened. Just he wanted to play, and he would always jump on the kids while they were learning to walk, and it just became a problem. But so anyways, Gibbs had to get another family, which he's very happy with now. But we did get another dog who's been like the perfect podcasting dog because she will just come in and just chill out. Like she'll just get on the futon behind me if I'm recording at the house. And actually, even when I moved everything into the studio, I kind of wanted to bring her with me, but I don't want to push it with our landlord. Now it's going to be difficult here in the future though, because we've got this amazing space and we're so happy to have it. And we've gotten it just for a great deal. And part of the reason why we've been able to get it for a great deal is because they're about to renovate it. And so they are about to actually renovate it. And so my guess is my rent's going to go up a little bit when it's all said and done. But for a while there, we'll have to record either next door or figure something out, because obviously there'll be construction going on like crazy.
Well, speaking of cost, what about in the cost of time and money? That how much of that goes into your podcasting?
Into the local podcast, I've been trying to kind of take more of a step back and so that I can kind of get more of my time. Because honestly, that particular show ends up taking a good amount of time, given the fact that it's so reliant upon having a guest. It's not something that, for example, with Flash TV Talk, with that particular show, it's like, all right, every single Wednesday at this exact time, we're going to get on, we're going to talk for an hour, and then I'm going to spend an hour to hour 20 minutes editing it, and then it's done. With this, especially with the chosen format that we have, we set up the interview. We're relying upon them to actually show up for the interview. Whether or not they're any good is going to determine how difficult the editing is going to be. So the editing could take anywhere from 45 minutes to 2 hours. And then we also cut the show so that there's, a bit of a setup, a tease, a bookend to the tease, a bio, then the interview, then cut in the ad, then finish the interview, then outro. And if we have a musician, then we'll put some music in. And so it's one of the most difficult shows to edit, because I guess I'm an idiot. I guess when I was setting things up, I didn't think about that. And so actually one of the things that we've been looking at for season 3 is how can we make it a little bit more streamlined and make the editing process a little bit easier on ourselves, especially as we bring in new talent who does not necessarily have a couple of years of background in audio engineering or audio editing or anything like that. But yeah, so it has historically been a big time sink. It's becoming less of that as I've brought in some new hosts and as we've kind of looked at tweaking the format to be a little bit more less editing intensive. In terms of money, with the local show, I tend to prefer people to actually come to the studio. But if we do have the setup from time to time where people ask that we come to their office, in which case, we've got a nice little Zoom, which has just been a godsend. I love that thing. It looks like a taser. I don't know if you've ever used one before, but if your audience hasn't invested in a Zoom recorder, it's a great addition to whatever your current studio setup, because you can take your mics with you, plug it directly in. You don't have to have your computer. You don't have to have an interface. You just plug that bad boy in and go, and you get some great audio out of it. But like I said, I do kind of prefer for them to be in studio, just because that way there's less variables, so to speak. At the moment right now, tech-wise, I'm using Pro FX 12 channel. It's great for what it is. I think if I could do it all again, I probably would have gotten a PreSonus interface, which has a lot less bells and whistles on it, but more allows me to do more on the back end in terms of separating all the audio channels. We're getting to the point now where we'll have more than just me and one or two other people. We actually did an episode with a local group here where they had 3. It was 3 plus me. So we had 4 people recording in the studio at a given time, each with individual mics. And so I had to invest in some a 4th mic for that particular recording. And since I couldn't get the exact same type of mic, that one audio sounded off to me, and it made for a very difficult editing experience. So, just I do believe in kind of growing organically, though. Starting off, I mean, if you don't need but an audio box and 2 mics, then just get an audio box and 2 mics and then go from there.
All right, now before we wrap up this conversation, share some best practices, some wisdom you've gained from your experience as a podcaster, and especially as a local podcaster.
If you're doing local, which obviously if you listen to this podcast, that's a goal, that's a focus of yours. You want to make sure that you are partnering with local influencers, especially if you're in a town like ours where you're not necessarily a tourist trap. I mean, if you're really creating content for that local community, you need to have the local community's buy-in into what you're trying to do. And that means having them on your show. That means reaching out to businesses and saying, hey, look, we're wanting to do this thing. Will you help support us in the creation of this? And really kind of painting the picture of what it is you want to do in creating this local community around this podcast. When you're thinking about advertisers to sponsor your show, I would suggest think about who your ideal audience member is. Who are you actually talking to? Give that person a name. Like, figure out what it is they do. Where do they work? How much money do they have? Do they have a dog? Do they have kids? Go through the entire description of what your audience member is, and then think about, okay, now who else is trying to advertise to that person? Who else wants to get their products in front of that person? And then go to those local businesses and say, hey, look, you're trying to reach this person, so am I. Although I'm trying to create a relationship with her, sponsor my show, sponsor me trying to create this relationship with this audience member so that we can sponsor your products in a much more powerful way than anyone else. That's what people who are trying to find an audience, that's what they want to hear. They want to know that you're building those relationships, and they're going to want to help you build those relationships. So I've got to say it again because I think it's incredibly important. Make sure they're aware of the Satchel Podcast Player. In fact, make sure you register your show on Satchel, because not only are they able to find content by location, and not only are you able to engage with them in more ways, but if you want to, you can activate that donation button so that they can your existing audience can actually support you by just donating directly in the podcast player itself. It's very powerful to be able to have that call to action right there. And when you're starting out, you're not going to have a ton of listeners. You might only have maybe a dozen or so when you're first starting out, depending on the size of your city. But as you build that up, as you get to your first 100, as you get to your first 1,000, as you get to your first 10,000, having those early listeners supporting you from the get-go, they're going to want to see you win, and they're going to want to help you do that. So offering up opportunities like that and letting them know that they can support you through the Satchel Podcast Player and find you and other local podcasts through the Satchel Podcast Player. It's obviously it's helpful to me because it's my company, but it's also helpful to you because our goal is really to create a podcast player that benefits the podcaster and the listener at every single level. If you're creating a local podcast, you're going to want to get whatever that city is, citypodcast.com, statepodcast.com. The great thing about Let's Talk Jackson is that if you go to jacksonpodcast.com, it takes you straight to Let's Talk Jackson. If you go to mississipipodcast.com, it takes you straight to Let's Talk Jackson. And so, I would strongly recommend that as kind of one last minute best practice in there. But all that to say, if you go to jacksonpodcast.com or letstalkjackson.com, you can also find that podcast as well.
All right. Thank you, Beau, for being a guest on Podcast Local.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, and thank you for what you're doing for the local podcast community.
Links to Let's Talk Jackson, the Podastery Network, the Satchel Player, and Beau York on Twitter are all at podcastlocal.com. Do you podcast local too? Or does the idea of a local podcast intrigue you? Come by the site and sign up for our email newsletter. I'll be sharing tips and ideas for podcasting in general and local podcasting in particular. And if you sign up right now, you can get a free on-the-go guide for Podcast Local, 7 ways to tell the stories of your community. You can find what you need at podcastlocal.com. I'm Jason Norris, and thank you for listening to Episode 3 of Podcast Local from On The Go FM.